Today's lesson is on writing equivalent statements for proportions, and it covers pages 20 and 21 in your Jump Math 7.2. The first question is going to give you a series of almost face-like looking sequences of dots and ovals that you are going to write 4 equivalent statements for. So the equivalent statements are going to come in several formats. The first one is going to ask you what fraction of the dots are shaded. 4 out of the 6 dots are shaded. So we're focusing on the dots specifically and not on the big circles or groupings. The second equivalent statement is going to also be a fraction of what is shaded, but this time we're going to be looking at the groupings. So, what fraction of the groups are shaded? This would be 2/3 because 2 of the groups have shaded circles in them and 1 has unshaded circles. So there's 3 groups altogether. The sequence for our second one is going to be a little bit tricky. So we're going to start with the number of shaded dots is going to be our first number, and that is a fraction. So this will be the fraction of groups of, and then our final number is going to be the total number of dots. So to fill this in, we could look at how many shaded dots do we have. There are 4 dots, so this one's not going to be a fraction. And then that is what fraction, so this would be the fraction of group. Yeah, so it's 2/3 of, and then we have to look at our total number of dots altogether, which is 6. So our third way is saying 4 is 2/3 of 6. So our 4 little dots are 2/3 of the 6 dots. The final way that we are going to write an equivalent statement is by writing 2 equivalent ratios. So our first ratio is going to be shaded dots to total number of dots. So that will give us, so that gives us 4 to 6, and the little colon goes in the middle. And then our ratio of shaded groups to total groups would be 2 to 3. So these are the 4 different ways. So we're going to do another example that's asking us to do the same 4 types of equivalent statements. So our first type of equivalent statement is the fraction of little circles that are shaded. So this would give us 5 out of 10. Our second is writing the fraction of groups that are shaded. So 1/2 of the groups are shaded. Then we're looking at our combo of, we have a whole number is a fraction of a whole number. So what would we put for this last one? Our first step is to think of how many shaded dots do we have, which is 5. So 5 is what fraction of groups? 1/2 of 10, which is our total number of dots altogether. So it's almost like we're going, our numerator is second fraction of first denominator, right? And then lastly, we have our 2 equivalent ratios, which would give us, so a 5 to 10 ratio is equal to a 1 to 2 ratio. For question number 2, they're going to ask us for each picture, write a pair of equivalent ratios. So they've shown us a picture where we've said 4, that's the shaded dots, is 1/2 of 8, that's the total number of dots. So we need to write our two ratios out. So we're looking at a part to whole ratio. So for the first ratio, we would put 4 to 8, and our second ratio would be 1 to 2. So we're kind of looking at our shaded and unshaded, and then our shaded groups and unshaded groups. Question 3 is similar, but we're going to break this down again. So 15 is 3/4 of 20. So our first ratio in the part whole is going to say 15 to 20. And then we can convert our fraction 3/4. So our second ratio will be 3 to 4. Now we're going to turn these into fractions. So ratios can also be written as fractions if they're part over whole. So our first fraction would say 15 over 20, and our second fraction will say 3 over 4. So it's all the same kind of pieces, we're just moving them together differently. So the difference for question 4 is we're going to be dealing with a missing piece of information, and we can represent that using a question mark. So if we look at 12 is 4/5 of what number? First, we need to identify what our main part is. So what would our part be? 12 would be our part because 12 is the fraction of our second piece. Now, do we know what our whole number is? No. So we're going to put a question mark for the whole. Then we're going to write our second ratio that is equivalent. So our second ratio would be 4 to 5. Now we're going to turn both of these into fractions. So our first fraction would be 12 over question mark, and our second would be 4 out of 5. Okay, we're going to look at a different setup for this with a different piece of missing information. So 20 is how many thirds of 30? So sometimes we can kind of go through and go, okay, what do we know? So do we know what our first part is? It would be 20. So we're going to put that here. And then we look at, do we know what our whole is for the whole thing? So if 20 is the part, what would the whole be? It would be 30. That's our number on the end here. Now, we just have to figure out what to do with this how many thirds. So what does the thirds tell us? So the thirds would tell us that something is out of 3, right? And just because we deal with that with fractions often, do we know how many groups of the thirds? No, so we would have like a question mark there, right? So how would we turn our 20 to 30 into a fraction? It would become 30. It would become 20 over 30. So this might help us figure out, can we move this over here and turn it into a ratio? What would that give us? It would give us question mark 2, 3, right? So a 20 to 30 ratio is equal to a unknown to 3 ratio, when 20 over 30 is equal to something out of 3. Okay, for question number 5, we're going to be looking at this with the word percent in it instead. So 15 is what percent of 20? So can we figure out our part and our whole from that? So it would be 15 to 20. We have those two bookends. Now when we're figuring out the what percent, the what is a question mark, and the percent tells us the second number is going to be out of 100. So our second ratio would be question mark 2, 100. So now we're going to be turning those into fractions. So as a fraction, it would become 15 out of 20 equals question mark out of 100. So we're still dealing with an unknown piece of information. Question number 6 is going to break this down a little bit differently. So we have what percent of 30 is 5? So what would our part be in this question? Our part would be 5. Our whole would be 30. and our percent is unknown, so it's a question mark. To write our two fractions, we would have
5 over 30 and question mark out
5 out of 30 and question mark out of
of 100.
100, because our percent is always out of 100. So for part A, that's all you're doing. We'll go over B as well. That was recording the whole time? Cool. So if 7 is 20%, what is 100%? Our part would be 7. Do we know what our whole would be? We don't know because it's asking what is 100%, but our percentage is 20. So to write our two fractions, the first one would be 7 out of question mark equals 20 out of 100. So for today, we're not actually solving these. That will be the next lesson. We're just figuring out how to get into these equivalent fractions.